we really appreciate y'all being here. My name is Joe Rowland. I'm the Organic Initiatives Coordinator for the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. I'm here with Sarah Runkle as well, who I will let introduce herself momentarily. But we're also going to uh, ask you to go ahead and throw your name, where you are, a little bit about yourself in the chat if you would like, so we can all kind of review that and see where we're all coming from. A little bit about CFSA. Hopefully, you're all familiar with us. We're the oldest sustainable agriculture nonprofit in the Southeast. We focus primarily on the Carolinas, working with sustainably, ecologically minded, kind of organic, regenerative, whatever that word is you want to use, farmers. Also, with a focus on what USDA would consider historically underserved, socially disadvantaged growers, BIPOC, people of color, female growers, veterans, and then beginning farmers, people that are farming less than 10 years. USDA considers kind of in that category as well. Um, we have a lot of different areas that we work in. So here's our key areas that we offer technical assistance. We also do a lot of advocacy work, whether we're in Washington or Raleigh, down in Columbia, kind of advocating for policy for these small scale, organically minded operations. But kind of our boots on the ground divisions, farm services and local food. We're doing some organic production as well as the food safety, GAP certification, those sort of things. Market access goes in there if you're looking to kind of find or develop a new market for some crops. I work in high tunnels, so working with equip funding through NRCS, helping growers identify the proper tunnel, the placement for it, some of those issues, as well as we do some conservation planning around soil health and around organic transition and certification. And we're working on some climate resiliency planning and things like that this year. So lots of ways that we can help, lots of ways to contact us. Take a snapshot of these, or you can always go to carolinafarmstewards.org to get some information. Sarah, you want to say hello before we get going?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Sarah Runkle. I'm the local food program director with CFSA. I live in Western North Carolina and oversee our food safety and market access work. But my background is as a diversified vegetable farmer, and I worked for Extension for a number of years, and I'm excited to be doing this weed management series with y'all. So I will be monitoring the chat, so feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll be sharing links, but also want folks to know that we will send a follow-up email with all the links that are shared during the presentation.
We are talking biological, mechanical, and chemical weed control or weed management today. Little recap over the last few sessions, talking about what weeds are, what makes them weedy. Read through this list. The big ones I think about is they're going to take over, they colonize, they're opportunistic. They reproduce rapidly, often producing a lot of seeds. They're vigorous growers. They can, outcompete some other crops for nutrients, for resources, water, fertilizers, things like that. Often they like disturbed soil. Often they are good at traveling around, whether that be through the wind, through water, getting into equipment, getting on animals, on, boots and pants and that sort of thing. So, definitely problematic in that respect. Understanding the life cycle is going to be critical. This is some more review here of the last few sessions, but understanding if we're looking at annuals, biennials, or perennials. With annuals, of course, they're completing their life cycle in 1 year. They're putting down seed, and that next generation's coming up. Biennials, similar, except that's going to happen over 2 years. And then perennials are going to be there year in and year out. They're growing back from the root system, from a crown. They may be spreading by seed, by rhizomes, stolons, things like that. So we want to understand that because we are trying to control the spread of that reproduction, right? So we need to understand what times of year, when in the life cycle, we can have the best results of eradicating them. We also talked a little bit about just understanding the physiology of the plants and those sort of things in our first session. And then last week we were talking about disturbance, the ways in which we culturally may cause issues for ourselves. A lot of weeds we kind of bring onto our own farm. We create situations in which weeds can thrive, like bare soil, lawns and landscapes, monocropped areas where certain weeds can kind of take hold and find a niche in that ecosystem. And then we create opportunities for invasives. Last week we talked about Johnson grass and Japanese stilt grass, things that were used in packaging with stilt grass, or Johnson grass was going to be a forage crop for cattle. Sometimes it might be ornamentals that they use in the like landscaping industry that can jump out into the environment and become invasive for us. So definitely when we're thinking about how to control weeds, think through the things that you do on your farm that create these opportunities and might exacerbate the problem that you're actively working to control. And then lots of ways for weeds to move, to disperse. The biggest ones that I think we can control are listed here in our tillage practices and moving our equipment around, right? We know that disturbed soil is a great place for weeds to get established, but the act of disturbing soil is bringing up weeds from the weed seed bank that we learned about. That is just years and years of past dormant seeds that are just waiting on that opportunity for oxygen, sunlight, water that they're ready to germinate. So tillage, bringing those to the surface is going to create a weed problem typically. Manures, composts, and mulches. Really anything we're going to bring onto the farm, any inputs, anything that we're going to apply to our soil, especially things that we're going to broadcast like across our whole field, like you would think of cover crop seeds or compost, manure, things like that. We really got to understand where it's coming from, what the species is, what animal it was for the manure, what their feed source was, so that we don't have viable seeds that are moving into our system with some of those inputs. The same goes with irrigation water. If we're irrigating from a pond or something that has viable seeds in it. Um, and then contaminated seed, I kind of alluded to, but use a reputable source that is verifying that the seed is weed free, disease free, all of those sort of things. So wind, water, and soil can seem like things that are a little harder for us to control, but there are things like windbreaks. We talked about not irrigating out of surface water or filtering surface water that we are going to irrigate with, and then limiting disturbed soil, but also watching the way that natural systems, erosion, and things like that are going to create bare soil and also transport soil and therefore seeds into new areas. So, um, most of the recap. Last week we talked a lot about prevention and cultural controls. This week we're shifting more to mechanical, biological, and chemicals. Like we're actually going to get out there and try to control these weeds on our own. This slide is an interesting one to put in here because it has nothing to do with weeds, but I was just putting this presentation together and looking through some slides from a soil health workshop that I've done, and it hit me that we're talking about the same three things. When I think about soil health, I think about, or soil properties, I think about the chemical, like the structure of the chemistry in the soil, the physical structure of the soil, what it's actually made up of, and then the biology, right? The microbes, the critters that are in the soil. We're thinking about those same three categories when we think about weeds. So we're thinking about physical, or what we're going to refer to more as mechanical today, chemical controls using herbicides, and then biological controls using some other beneficials and biologicals in that system. So that's kind of just a framework of where we're going. And as soon as this is moving, so some biological control methods, they kind of fall into four broader buckets, if you will. Classical biological controls is just the use of beneficial insects, whether it be some of these bioherbicides, mycoherbicides, fungal pathogens, things like that, that are going to act to either attack the weed species itself or inhibit its germination or growth or seed predation, some of those kind of things. If we move to an inundative strategy, is where we are applying larger numbers of those beneficials. Some people might have purchased ladybugs in the past for like aphid problems in greenhouses or high tunnels. It's kind of that approach where we're going to buy or use a large amount of a specific biology to kind of attack this targeted weed species. Conservation is creating a habitat, creating a wildlife habitat or pollinator areas, or creating a beneficial area that is going to attract some of those beneficial predatory insects and things that we want to help us in that situation. And then grazing. We can obviously use livestock, and we're going to talk about that, I think, in another slide or two. So some big ones are, insects, beetles, birds, and rodents for seed predation, letting the creatures that are out there and already want to eat seeds and survive on those help eliminate some of the weeds that we have in our system. Grazing animals, I think, is pretty self-explanatory to you. There's some nuances that are coming up in just a moment. And then bioherbicides and mycoherbicides here, using these fungal pathogens that can actually infect and kill a weed species. This feels like kind of a top tier strategy and not one that I'm very familiar with, but the same with using some soil-borne pathogens that can actually kind of act to suppress germination of weed seeds. But these are high level. If you can implement these and get these funguses, these bacterias working for you while you're out operating your farm, it's a beautiful system that's running behind the scenes that isn't hopefully costing you a lot of time or energy, but can really help to be effective. So biological controls are definitely something that we want to be considerate of. And it can be some things as simple as creating those environments around your farm, right? So beetle banks, here's a three-step guide to kind of how you would build a beetle bank. It's a raised berm, a perennial vegetative strip near your production areas that just allows a habitat that's not destroyed. If you're tilling constantly, prepping beds, weeding, moving soil around, you're not creating an environment that's good for these ground dwelling insects to set up shop. So by creating a space where they can always live and then come into the field and back, you are creating that environment. I'm blown away by this fact down here at the bottom left that these beetles can reduce the current year's contribution of weed seeds to the seed bank by 80 to 90%. That is nothing to laugh at. Like that is pretty substantial. Now they may not go into the soil and mine out seeds from the past that are dormant, but just like we want to stop weeds from going to seed every year and adding to the bank, if these beetles can literally control 80 to 90% of the weeds that accidentally do go to seed on your farm in a given year, that's pretty huge. So I think these planting strips can be really nice additions, hedgerows, beneficial pollinator strips that also create this undisturbed habitat. So um, I think that is a great strategy. We talked about integrating animals. I'm not a livestock guy, but this comes straight from kind of, if you were thinking about regenerative agriculture, the five kind of keys to regenerative agriculture, one of them is integrating animals. Um, and if you think about it from, a lot of these can be thought of from like a rotational grazing standpoint, as far as like the timing, when during the cropping season or when during the life cycle of that plant are we bringing the animals onto it? How often are we bringing them there? How many animals are on at one time, intensity wise, per area? And then how long we leave them there, and then how much time that area needs to rebound. Now, this is thinking more about like sustaining a healthy pasture. So we need to kind of switch our thinking a little bit when it comes to using them to eradicate a weed species. But I think timing is critical. We were just talking about the fact that manure can actually carry viable seeds with it. If we think about the way plants have evolved over time, birds eat seeds, they poop them out and drop them in this neat little nutrient package that hits the soil, and boom, it's ready to go. It's fertilized. Well, we could create a situation if we're putting animals onto a pasture with weeds going to seed at different stages, depending on the animal, the seed, how their gut microbes work. I would be curious to understand if weeds could literally pass straight through an animal and deposit them right back in the field that we're trying to stop. Again, I'm not a livestock specialist, but that is something that is popping to mind for me. Also, just the intensity of the grazing, right? If we just let them completely decimate a pasture trying to eradicate a species, we might have opened up some bare soil and a niche in which those weed species, perennial weeds, that are going to be resilient and able to come back, we might actually open up an opportunity where those weeds can now come back. There's a lot of nutrient in the area, so we could perpetuate a problem. But livestock can be utilized. Goats are the one I think of where you can put goats into a bramble patch and kind of help them fight back the woods in a certain area if you're trying to clear it. But as far as using them for weeds, I think it needs to be done with some caution and decent amount of research and understanding. We're going to move now kind of more towards the mechanical control of weeds. In the early slides here, I'm calling it more of like a physical control because it's more passive, like we're using tarps and mulches and things like that to just basically create a barrier, right? We're trying to limit sunlight most of all, really to kind of slow those weeds down from being able to grow properly. So living mulches in cover crops or organic mulches in straw, hay, wood chips, leaf mold, things like that can be used. We talked a good bit about that in the last session that they're all going to break down a little bit differently. They're all going to have, a different thickness or a depth that they need to be applied to really be um, efficient. It's also going to depend on what weeds we're dealing with, right? If we're dealing with tap-rooted, really heavy perennials, they're going to pop through a lot of like natural living mulches, whereas smaller broadleaf weeds that are germinating, they may not be able to make it through a few inches. So lots of considerations in that. I'm going to throw deep compost into that same sort of mulching category there. Landscape fabrics or tarps, we're talking polyethylene, heavy duty plastics that are going to be able to completely stop weeds from coming through there. For the most part, they'll stop most weeds from coming through there. And this would also include agricultural plastics. Agricultural plastic is not as thick. Agricultural plastic is one that you will see weeds coming through, nut sedge, different things like that can pop through. Whereas the landscape fabric, like in the bottom left picture, or the silage tarp in the bottom right, they're heavy duty. You're typically not going to have a lot of weeds pop right through those, hopefully. Um, Hugelkultur, another kind of form of deep compost or natural mulch where you incorporate some woody debris into the mix with some native soil to create kind of a heavily mulched bed that breaks down over time. Um, and then I will specifically talk about tarping, the bottom right picture, or occultation. We are occluding sunlight from those plants. The keys to this is getting it weighed down properly and nice and tight. The more kind of air gaps there are, the longer it's going to take to kind of properly heat up and really kind of control the vegetation underneath it. And it's going to depend again on what species you're trying to control, what time of year, how much vegetation is under there, right? All those factors are going to determine how long that tarp has to be in place to get what you want done. And then finally, solarizing would be using clear tarps. And so better strategy in my experience for newly establishing, newly germinating seeds, or even as a way to speed up germination of some weeds to be able to then control them, doesn't work as much like the regular tarps, the dark tarps will with going into an existing stand of a crop and smothering it. I've found that it does not always work as well with the clear tarps. So as we move more into mechanical cultivation, let's just think about what mechanical cultivation is. Obviously, it's using tools, implements, different attachments for tractors. It could be walk behind tractors, garden tillers, hand tools, and we're going to kind of progress through that scale of hand scale, hand weeding up to all tractor based, kind of more higher end, high tech strategies here. So, but how it works is we're disturbing the weeds at the right time, and timing really kind of is everything. Sarah talked a lot about it in her session a few weeks back, and then we talked more about it last time. But the white thread stage, it's when right after germination, the first leaves that come out are called cotyledons. The seed leaves, at that stage when they're just really young, succulent, they don't have a root system in place. It's pretty much just one little thread holding them, anchoring them to the ground. And the littlest bit of disturbance dislodges that connection, and the plant doesn't have enough energy reserves to reroot itself and start getting nutrients, getting water again. And so, especially on a sunny, warmer kind of day, that disturbance in that dry soil, and we're disturbing very shallow, just the top, less is better, half inch, inch of soil to dislodge those. That's when it really makes a lot of sense, right? And so we're fitting our tools to our system. And I love this picture because it's showing you how this tool fits this system. It's a raised bed system, 4 rows of what I'm going to say is lettuce per bed. And this attachment, which you notice is front end mounted on this tractor, which I always wanted one of these. I never got one. But it's cultivating or it is weeding in the pathways, in the tractor wheel marks where you would be walking. It's also weeding in between the crop all at the same time in one pass, right? So this is a great visual for make it fit your system, right? Um, and then start asking yourself, well, you have a production system, you have spacing for certain crops, and start figuring out what tools make sense to you and how do you decide what makes sense. Here's a few things we got to think about. Financially viable, right? Does it make sense on your farm? If you don't own a tractor, then this attachment probably is not going to be helpful for you because you're going to have to go and purchase tractors, afford all this equipment. If you're a half-acre market garden, this tool probably doesn't fit your needs, right? It's probably going to be just too much for you. It's not going to make sense to use it, to turn it around and try to get it into your tighter spacing. So economics is a big part of it. What resources do you already have? What strategies are you already kind of using or do you know about? And then how efficient is it from a time standpoint, right? In this case, if finances aren't a big deal, you already have the tractor, you're able to afford this setup, then it's probably pretty efficient for one person to drive this tractor through this field, making one pass per bed. You can be in and out of the field that we're looking at here, which looks like, probably 10, 12 beds right there. That's not going to take very long to drive that tractor up and down each bed. Financially, it's going to cost the labor of the person driving, some wear and tear on the equipment, and some diesel fuel. So, in the grand scheme of things, with the thousands of heads of lettuce that they have right here, probably fairly time efficient and pretty economically viable strategy, which then hopefully means that it's going to be profitable for them. I like to think about reducing physical stress. If I was to go out into this field and hand weed it on my hands and knees after the weeds were big and established, that'd be a nightmare. Or if I sent, one person with a hoe out to do this work, it would spend hours and hours possibly weeding the same amount of time that we could do in a half an hour with this tractor. And it's just going to be a lot harder on our body. It's going to be a lot more cost prohibitive from a labor standpoint. And then hopefully we're improving the health of ourselves, of our operation, of the crop, right? If the system you're using just isn't working and you're constantly having to weed multiple times or weeds are escaping whatever strategy you're employing and they're starting to compete with the crops and they're harboring pests and disease and it's not working and you're not seeing kind of like an efficient, healthy system, then we gotta pick a new strategy. We gotta try something else to kind of shake it up. So, a great publication from SARE. I think we're going to be sharing, or I know we're going to be sharing some resources with you. This is one of them, a great guide to go and read through and check out. But when we think about mechanical cultivation, there's a lot of attachments whether sometimes they're like shovels, sweeps, side knives, coulters, hiller discs. You may not know what any of those things are. That's okay. They're all different implements, different attachments. Oh, if you look at the picture, the kind of bottom left, the shovel kind of diagonal V-shaped looking metal piece there, that would be a sweep attached to a cultivating toolbar we're going to talk about a little bit later. Um, but they're all set up to do different things in the soil and with the crop, right? So there's tools that cut and slice, hula hose, side knives. They're going to go through the soil, skimming the soil fairly shallowly and just chopping things off. There's tools that are going to go in and uproot, tine weeders, rotary hose, things. These are probably going to, in some cases, move a little more soil, but the action is trying to get the roots up and out of the ground. Tools like sweeps or I think of disc hillers and things like that that are going to go through and cover, which can be a strategy if you have a very tiny white thread stage seedling just starting to germinate. If you just throw an inch or a couple inches of soil right on top, in a lot of cases, that's going to shade it out. It's going to mulch it in effect, and it's not going to be able to kind of pop through. And then tools that damage things. We're going to talk more about flame weeders and things that basically kind of damage the crop itself. So on the very small scale, starting out or on small acreage, probably what makes a lot of sense or probably what you have somewhere sitting in your barn or your shed or some of these smaller scale hand tools, right? And we're going to say timing at probably every slide because the timing really is critical on these, is getting them at the right stage before the weeds are big, before they're established and fully rooted and able to kind of keep bouncing back from whatever strategies you throw at them. So the timing is going to be really important and the spacing is really important. In that first slide with the tractor with the front mounted implements, spacing was really important there. But also in this bottom right picture, where I'm going to say that's lettuce again, I'm not sure, but spacing is important here, right? They're using a collinear hoe, very, very shallow, sharp blade, just skims the surface of the soil and uproots those weeds when they're at that light white thread stage, right? So in this situation, one person walking briskly through this soil with that collinear hoe spaced perfectly between these two rows of lettuce, pretty much probably one decent pass, and you've effectively weeded the space in between. Now, if you changed your spacing to 12 inches or to, 15 inches, well, then that same tool now takes two passes or three passes, right? So we've doubled our amount of labor to control the same amount of weeds based on that tool. So it might not make sense to use that tool and have your person or yourself, your employee, walk up and down the bed three times to do the same amount of weeding. We might need to step to the picture above it, to that tine rake. And now maybe the tine rake fits that spacing a little bit better, right? So these are all considerations that you want to kind of be making when it comes to the spacing of the crop. Um, Ergonomics, how it works on your body, how it feels for you. Are you bending over? Are you crouched over? Are you using a short-handled hoe that makes you stand in a really odd way the whole afternoon? Because that's not a sustainable way to do it over the long term. These collinear hoes are interesting because it's not your grandmother or grandfather's garden hoe, right? The ones that were like a right angle and they were just you were chopping. They're really meant for just digging. These are angled differently and hopefully they have a long enough handle where you're standing up straight and you're just skimming the surface, moving in a nice back and forth motion. Some of these tools are only meant to pull. Some of them you can push or pull. They're going to cut and disturb both directions. Um, so that's also a consideration based on the tool you're using. What else to say about this? Labor is always a consideration in farming, just in general. We're always considering like how long is this taking me and how much does it cost? And could I purchase a tool that does it faster and more efficiently and save on the labor? And that balance is tough. That's always going to kind of be for you to figure out on your operation what makes sense and thinking about what resources you have, capital investments when you're ready to invest in things, thinking about what that next step up in equipment would do and what opportunities it creates for you in labor is if you could get a new tool that cost X and it created this much more time in your system, is that the right trade-off for you? So always kind of considering our labor. Um, I put the bottom left picture there is kind of just a do-it-yourself small scale roller crimper, you know? So you can use some of these strategies that you would think are for larger farms or tractor-based methods. You can find ways to do them on the smaller scale, and you still need to just kind of judge, does it make sense in your system for your body, for your team, for the amount of time you have with your resources. So lots of different types of hand tools and attachments. We talked about the collinear hoe down there. There are wire weeders, which is that top left image. They've got some cool, I think, Never Sink, probably Johnny's. I'm not sure who else is making them these days, but some really cool tools that have one handle that can fit a bunch of different attachments that are easily interchangeable there. So depending on spacing being different or different weeds, different action, different movement of soil that you're going for, those can all be useful. Um, there are diamond shape, hoes. There are triangular hoes. There are stirrup hoes that are sometimes called scuffle hoes that, can move in that back and forth motion there. So getting familiar with a few of these. Most of these tools that we're talking about here in the grand scheme of things are very affordable. So having a few of them on your farm for these different situations um, makes a lot of sense. Here we go. Sarah Runkle, ladies and gentlemen, top left, flame weeding. Check her out. Flame weeders are awesome. Timing is important. If you wait too long and the crop is too large, it's just not going to make sense. You're going to spend a lot of fuel and a lot of time burning the top down, and it's just going to regenerate right from the roots. Grasses and things that have that crown at or slightly below the soil surface, they may not do well with this, right? Because you're going to burn the top off and they're going to bounce right back. Smaller broadleaf annual weeds, that white thread stage is going to work. Those two little cotyledons, those two little leaves are sitting there. They're very susceptible to this intense amount of heat. And the action is it ruptures the cell walls, right? It literally boils and explodes the cells of those plants and it just desiccates the whole top of the plant. It's not able to regenerate itself from there. They come in a lot of different sizes and styles. Sarah's got just a straight backpack with like a flamethrower. Um, the individual below there is still backpack mounted, but it's more of a ground driven style. There are some that come on carts so that you don't have to carry the tank on your back. And then there are some tractor based models, which I think I have a picture of a little bit later. So good strategy. Good strategy for what is called stale seed bedding. We've talked about this a little bit. I don't know if we've fully gone through it. I can't remember, but the idea is you prep a piece of ground. Let's say it's bare ground, it's ready to be planted, but then you wait before planting because you're going to get that flush of weeds. It's great if you could irrigate slightly or get a little bit of rain and get that first generation, that first flush of weeds from the seed bank to germinate. And then we're going to terminate those weeds and plant immediately, right? And so we've killed off one set of weeds and we're giving our crop a head start. There's other ways to do it with tillage, which we'll look at in a moment, but this is a great opportunity to do that. And it works really well on small seeded, direct seeded crops. Think carrots is the best example, really. And in the case of carrots, it's kind of fun and scary, depending on how you think of it, because oftentimes you will plant the carrot crop and people will plant beets in with the carrots. Beets germinate, around 10 days, carrots germinate around 14 or more, something like that. And so you should start seeing beets germinated, telling you you've got 3 or 4 days. And so you'll plant them all together. And when you see the first beets, you come in, you flame off the entire bed. And then hopefully the carrots are going to come up into a weed-free environment. You've killed that next generation. So without disturbing soil, which, in other stale seed bedding, we would till the top, just knock the crust off the soil and kill that first generation of weeds, which of course, if you had carrot seeds in the ground, is not going to be an option for you. So That's a cool strategy. It's a dangerous strategy. These things are dangerous. It's a flamethrower. It's extremely hot, high heat. I just dropped the backpack with the tank on my ankle one time and it hurt really badly and it was very dangerous as well. So be careful. Farming is a dangerous business, especially as we start talking about larger scale tractor-based implements. You always need to be paying attention to what's going on. Now we're going to think about we're still in this kind of small scale, but now we're going to think more tillage based. We're going to start moving more soil with these next implements, right? Like hand tools, you're just scraping the surface a little bit as we move into what is, a BCS or a walk behind tractor that can do some deeper tillage. The middle picture is a wheel hoe. Lots of different variations, styles, sizes, attachments that can be used on a wheel hoe. And then the right image is a tilther. Johnny's, I think, carries this. It's powered by a hand drill. So very, very shallow, very light disturbance, really just knocking the crust off the soil, creating a good seed bed for direct seeding crops and things like that. But also is an opportunity to go in at the white thread stage and just take out that first generation of weeds. The thing here is minimal disturbance, right? We don't want to invert a lot of soil. We're trying to just skim the surface like with the other tools, staying as shallow as we can. And this is a great stale seed bedding technique to go in like the tilther on the right and just kind of eradicate that first generation. The wheel hose, they do make a lot of very high-end fancy ones that have finger weeders and multiple different attachments that as we move forward and start talking about tractor-based implements and toolbars and things like that, they make these smaller scale human-powered machines that mimic that same idea of different attachments of different sizes and depths working in a space to to meet whatever needs you have based on the crops that you're using there, right? So whether it's one row down the center and you're cultivating either side to like we saw 4 rows of lettuce and you're trying to cultivate in between them, they have some attachments there. And all of these are mid-level price-wise. I think the tilther's up there in the multiple hundreds. Wheel hose, you can get them from 100, a couple hundred to, probably in the $1,000 or more range with multiple attachments. And then BCSs, they're an investment. You can get them used. I see them 3 or 4 thousand, but 5, 6 thousand, I think, new. Somebody chime in if they know off the top of their head. But when you start adding implements, the next thing people are in the $10 and $12,000 range without trying too hard, I believe. So we're stepping up. We're continuing to kind of step up, and it'll depend on the scale, the size of your farm, how much acreage you're trying to keep under cultivation, as to whether these make sense for you really or not. Um, Oh, we are tractor-based equipment. And there you go. The bottom right is a tractor-based. That look, I don't know if that's homemade, farmer-made flame weeder there, but that would scare me. I'm not even gonna lie to y'all. Like I would be a little bit um intimidated to drive around with a huge flaming bomb on the back of my tractor. But it looks like it's doing the job. And so can't argue with success. And then on the top is the roller and crimper. Notice that chevron pattern that is supposedly pretty important to make sure that it crimps but doesn't cut into the crop. And you have a standing crop that you just roll across and roll it down, and it bends it in a few places every few inches as that pattern goes across the stem. And it doesn't chop it as to where it would then possibly regrow and sprout. It just bends it, it cuts the flow of nutrients and water through the plant and kills it, creating a living mulch right in place there. You can add water to those to make them much heavier or to get the weight the way you kind of need it to be to make sure that you are crimping and not cutting. Um, these are all going to be typically useful on a little larger acreage, and your spacing of your crops is going to have to fit, right? Because the tractor tires are going to define how big your beds are or how far between beds there are, all those kind of things. So you need to match your system to the tractor you have. um, Often can be more time efficient. I used to cultivate about 5 acres with a tractor, and I could do it in a couple of a couple hours, and I would do the whole farm every week or two. And that was our major weed strategy was we're going to plant, we're going to stale seed bed, we're doing all the sort of things that we can up front, and then we're going to run these tractor mounted implements through the crop kind of as many times as we can until the crop gets too big or to the point where we're going to start damaging the crop by doing it. Um, Major factors are upfront investments. Tractors, these tractor mounted implements. Now we're talking about thousands, multiple thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, depending on if you're buying used or new. Um, there's upkeep and maintenance. It's another gas powered, diesel powered engine that may not run the way you want it to on the day you need it to, right? So you're changing oil and filters and you're greasing and you're maintaining another large piece of equipment, which there's a learning curve to. It takes some knowledge and some understanding. It takes a certain level of skill to operate them properly. It'll take you a little while, especially with cultivation equipment, which I'll wait till we get to the next slide to kind of talk about why. Um, and I already said it before, but they're dangerous. Now we're talking about, implements that kill and maim people regularly. And so we need to be way more conscious of how we're operating, who's around us when we're operating, all those kind of tractor safety things. Cultivation toolbars. This is like one of my favorite things to do in farming, y'all, is get on my tractor. It's a beautiful day. The crops are all growing and you've got things set up so you can make like one pass, like we talked about with the collinear hoe, right? You can make one pass briskly walking, or in this case, driving your tractor through a crop, and you are weeding the whole area around that crop. And hopefully, if it's done right at the right time and with the right amount of weed pressure, that may be the extent of what you need to do is go through, a few times throughout the life of that crop to keep it weed free enough to get a successful harvest. So what I love about it is it's really versatile. You can see the picture at the top. They've got, a bunch of what looks like sweeps or just shanks, small shanks running. There's multiples on this toolbar. They're doing the pathways behind the tractor tires, but they're also doing in row in between the crops. They may have it looks like set up to where it's kind of weeding the edge, the shoulder of the beds as well. If you kind of look down at the bottom, same thing. They've got three, four different attachments happening on this. The wheels are called guide wheels because you can set it up so that you can just let the implement down and not have to think about, am I too deep? Am I plowing now? Am I plowing 6 inches down? Because we don't want that. We're going to bring up a bunch of weeds. We're going to tear up our soil structure. We're going to damage our equipment because these things aren't meant to plow. And so you can set the guide wheel. I mean, also it's going to work with the contour of the field. And so as you're as you're going over the field, some high spots and low spots, it's keeping the implement engaged with the soil at the depth that you want. In theory, it doesn't always work exactly like that. You have to still be monitoring and managing it. But you see a couple different size and widths of the sweeps down there, the triangular, iron pieces. Depending on how wide the spacing is on your crop, you're using some of those. Um, so versatile, easy to move around. Um, you need to think about the diameter of the toolbar, right? Are we talking 2 inches, 4 inches? Because you're going to have brackets that then are going to attach all of these things to them. And so they are really interchangeable as long as you have the same size toolbar. Um, and so one thing that I did was have multiple toolbars, right? Instead of having more expensive options and full-on cultivating tractors, which we're about to look at, if I was growing something that was a one-row crop, like let's say, I don't know, what's something that we grow just one single row down the middle of a bed? Um, it could be anything. We'll just say tomato. Tomato is a terrible choice because once they're trellised, you're never cultivating mechanically, but I'm brain dead at the moment, and that's what I was thinking of. So one row of tomatoes down the middle. I have a toolbar that's set up to do either side of the tomatoes and the pathways. Now, if I go to 2 crops per bed, like let's say I have broccoli or something, I have the toolbar set up with one shank in the middle that is weeding in between the broccoli and the pathways. And we can keep mixing and matching. If I have scallions on 4 rows, well, now I have 3 sets of shanks, much smaller, thinner, that are just cutting in between each of the rows of scallions, right? And so it's a pretty economical way on a tractor-based system to go out and buy 2 or 3 toolbars and a bunch of different attachments, sweeps, shovels, side knives, all those things, and have them set up so when it's time to go cultivate the 1 row stuff, you hook up that toolbar and you do the whole farm. Anything that's 1 row, you do it. And when it's time to go do 2 row, you hook up a different toolbar. Still annoying, lots of changing implements back and forth, but on a limited budget, that's how I got by for a few years. More complicated toolbar systems. The one at the top, I think, is called a Williams toolbar, or it might also be called like a Lilliston or Tineweeder. Somebody jump in there in the chat and tell me if they know.
Yeah,
Um,
that's the Williams toolbar.
cool,
I'm dropping a link to the
perfect,
video and a supplier.
perfect. I have used this piece of equipment before. It's kind of cool. As you can see, there's a whole series of tines, of single tines in the back that are going to be able to go straight over the crop. Like it's called blind cultivation. We're going right through the crop. We're not thinking about where the crop is, like because the disturbance is going to be there isn't going to disturb the crop itself. This is going to be for certain, like you see it with the with the tine rake, tine weeders and leafy greens and small crops that are well rooted, nicely rooted to the soil, where you can go through and move soil all around them, but the crop itself can kind of move enough that if you hit it, you're not going to completely uproot it and destroy it, right? I would not use a tine weeder or this implement to go over the crop top of a broccoli crop because it's big, broadleaf. We're going to just destroy it. But like maybe small onions or direct seeded baby greens when they're kind of small, um, there's probably a lot of better examples. And if somebody has one, please jump in. I've used this in limited experience, but that's kind of the idea as far as the tines go. And then you look towards the front, it's got shanks, sweeps, other things. So it's working the side of the bed, the shoulders there. It's got guide wheels that we talked about. So we're working at a specific depth. Um, and you're able to kind of cultivate in a couple different ways with a couple different styles of attachments, all in one machine, all in one pass. It's cool. It is a cool system. Um, Down below, I've never used this finger weeder. Much more high tech, much more expensive, much more dialed in. You can be way more precise and get way closer to a crop. You notice there's a seat there. There is actually someone sitting, there's someone driving the tractor, and then there's someone sitting on this implement steering that through the crop, right? So if it starts to get too close or the crop row isn't perfectly straight and meanders one way or the other, this person is driving the implement to keep it flowing with the way that the crop is planted there. So, um, definitely a great strategy. If you are on a larger acreage and you have very tight spacing and like fine seeded crops that you're trying to really get weeded up close, this is a great option. I've always wanted to get to drive one. If anybody has one and will let me come and play with it, I would appreciate that. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So they're not going to fit all systems. Um, the Williams toolbar, we would use it sometimes for bed prep and for like stale seed bedding. You know, it's going to go through and just shake all those white threaded seedlings. It's going to shake them up. It's going to dislodge a lot of them. There are some places where there's enough space in between those tines that you may have some weeds sneak through. So it's not always a perfect thing. But these are good options. Um, these are good options to do. So again, the difference between blind cultivation and in-row cultivation, the one up top is blind. The tines are going right over the top of a crop if you're using it in that way. Whereas down below, we are cultivating in row, in between the spacings of our plants. We're being very cautious to just hit the areas in between. So what I haven't said yet, and I'll say it now, it might show up in a minute, I can't remember, but when we're thinking about mechanically cultivating and we're moving a little more soil in here, the big things to think about is the depth that we're using the attachment or the implement, the speed that we're traveling across the field, and the angle, the severity of the pitch to how we have that implement set up, right? And so when we're driving fast, we want to be moving fairly fast because the slower you go, kind of the more movement of soil you get and the more damage to crops you may end up with. So we want to be moving fairly quickly at shallow depth without too much of an aggressive angle on this thing. So we're not throwing a ton of soil, but there might be moments where we're trying to cover things. And so we are going to change the angle to be a little more aggressive because we do want to throw heavy amounts of soil to kind of shade things. And so we need to understand what the operation is we're trying to get at. But for the most part, you need to be thinking about the speed you're traveling, the depth into the soil you're working, and how aggressively you have the angle of your attachments, right? So there are tractors that do a lot of this stuff for you. Um, the picture on the right, I'm showing you because it's an offset tractor where you are sitting off to the side. The reason for that is you want to be able to look past the engine of the tractor and see the bed below you. You want to see what you're cultivating because you have what's called belly mounted implements, and you may have some attachments behind the tractor. And so you want to watch where you're driving to see if you're hitting that spot the right way, if you're weeding in between the row, or if you're starting to damage crops. Same thing in the picture on the right. There's another picture I'll just switch to now and see if it shows up better. Yeah, yeah. So both more advanced cultivating tractor options here. The Tillmore on the left, and this might be an Alice Chalmer G, but you can see, or it's close to what a G looks like. You can see that there's almost no floor or tractor beneath your feet. And these implements again are belly mounted. They're underneath you, and they're everything we've talked about so far is the same. They're set up spacing wise to fit the crop that you're cultivating, and you're able to look straight down at the row, almost like the finger weeder from a moment ago, where someone was driving the implement. Effectively, you're doing the same thing, but you're driving the implement as you drive the tractor. Um, Again, you can add additional implements to the back. These can be used for some bed prep as well to kind of go through and mellow some soil out and get to that weed-free stale seedbed situation you're going for, and then also to weed existing crops where they are. We're going up in cost. We're going up in sophistication of operations and spacing because this tractor can't go, it can only go in the tractor wheel march, right? Like you can't veer off and go, oh, well, I planted this wrong, so I'm just going to drive over here and get it. You're driving across your beds, you're crushing plants, you're making a mess of the field. And so you really need to plant properly and in straight lines, which often, if you're going to design a system around mechanical cultivation, cultivating tractors, toolbars, and things like that, you also need to have designed a system for planting, whether it's mechanical transplanters, water wheel transplanters. You need to have a way to make sure things are planted in line, straight, pretty well evenly spaced from themselves to fit the attachments that you're going to come through there on the back end with. These are just fun. I've never seen one. I've never used one. I've heard of some farmers making them. You can Google this prone or lay down weeders. These are one is tractor mounted. So there's somebody driving a tractor with five people laying down. Um, I would have to make sure it was really efficient because it's hard for me to stomach. I'm paying people to lay down as we drive around the field. But if it works, I won't argue with it. The other person over here, is that thing solar powered? Like there's a battery on it. I don't understand, but I love it. It looks like he might be weeding. He might also be planting or transplanting. So I threw this in here to be funny, but also because farmer innovation is key. You can find pictures of people doing this sort of thing online with two bicycles and a frame in the middle. And so the ergonomics of it to make it more efficient, to make it more enjoyable, to do a task that often is not that enjoyable, right? It costs us time and money. And so lots of ways to go about it. I would also like to play with one of these if anybody ever makes one and wants to invite me over. Let's do it. I'm gonna move quick through these. Make sure we have enough time for things. The last one is just straight up tillage, tractor-based tillage, which we want to, minimize as much as we can. Soil disturbance is not great for a lot of soil health related reasons. It also is problematic for weeds. But a lot of you may have a rototiller. I mean, look at what I think this lady is doing down here in the bottom picture. She's weeding that field for sure. She's going from a straight lawn into a ready to plant bed with just a rototiller, right? Now, we would never want to go about it in this way, really. We would want to be using that at a shallower depth. Those are obviously well-established weeds. It's a full-on lawn situation. But a lot of you own one of these. I have one of these. It's an easy way to do it. You prep the bed. You haven't planted it for a week or two. It's time to go in with your crop. And there's a ton of weeds there. And we learned last time, you can't plant into a weedy situation. You're going to be fighting from behind. The crops are going to struggle. It's going to be a problem for you. So sometimes this is the easiest strategy if you have one of these on the farm, is to just lightly come through until that top, inch or so. If you're doing heavier tillage, I threw these pictures in just to let you know that other options exist. The rototiller is spinning like this. Hopefully you can see me. Um, and it is inverting soil layers. It's bringing lower soil up. It's taking soil from the top down. That's what we want to kind of get away from. So the top two images, the one on the right is a power harrow. It's spinning more like horizontally, like a tornado, I guess, if you would think of it that way. So it's stirring soil and supposedly not inverting in the same way that a rototiller would. I believe that you could probably use one of those for stale seed bedding. I don't know. I haven't done it. And that spader, not a weed management strategy, but as I'm talking about tillage, I just wanted to show you that this spader is a set of knives, basically the spades that just chop into the soil in more of a vertical fashion to loosen soil up and not invert layers. And so just know that other options exist that are a little bit softer on soil structure when we're thinking about those kind of things. So, chemistry. Um, Sarah, feel free to jump in anywhere here that you want. Um, there are
Sure.
some limited options when we're talking about organic chemical controls, right? We're going to go out and buy chemicals to apply herbicides that are going to target and kill a plant species, hopefully not causing any downstream effects to the rest of our crops, the ecosystem, the beneficial insects, the soil, microbiome, all that kind of stuff. They can be expensive. It's still a pesticide. It's still um, meant to harm and hurt things. So we need to read the label. We need to understand any kind of protective equipment we need to be wearing. We need to understand how safe or when it's safe for us to go back into an area or have our staff go back into an area in which we've applied this chemical. We need to understand what rate that we need and how we need to mix it to make sure that it's effective and it's safe. Um, so all that is found in the label. So you need to make sure you familiarize yourself with that. And there's probably just some limited situations in which this strategy is going to make a lot of sense for you. Um, Kind of types of chemical controls and how they work. These non-selective contact herbicides, they're going to kill anything that they come in contact with, right? It's going to harm your crop. So if you're not careful about how you're using this, you're basically going to weed everything. You're going to kind of harm every plant that it comes into contact with. These are probably safest around perimeters, around edges of beds. I would be more cautious of getting in a bed and trying to target a weed that's competing directly with my cash crop since I know that these have a tendency or have the option of harming that crop. Post-emergence, these are the after the weeds emerge, right? So once the weed is up, you're going to spray these. They're going to be best on smaller annual weeds. Um, a lot of these things work better at higher temperatures in full sunlight. They can use that the photosensitivity works to its advantage. Um, and then let's see what this says. Yeah, so they're not moving through the plant. They're not systemic. There are some chemicals that they are going to be taken up by the plant and run through the whole system of the plant, and that's how they operate. Um, but these are not going to do that. They're not going to work like a lot of these strategies. They just don't work on really large, well-rooted, established crops or perennial crops that, yeah, you spray it and it dies back, and it's just like you mowed it and it died back, and it's going to grow right back. Um, so keep a lot of those things in mind there. Talking about some different active ingredients where it's acetic acid, soaps. I don't know what caprylic acid is, but these are some of the main ingredients in organic chemicals. They're going to be needed in a higher concentration, and you're going to need to thoroughly kind of coat. You need to make sure that you get a full application onto the plant to really have it do that. Um, like with a lot of organic chemistry, you may need to reapply, right? You may need to reapply, especially if we have weather events, if we have rain afterwards. It's just like pesticides. If you apply something 2 weeks later, you may still have that pest species there that you need to go back and reapply for. So keep in mind, keep the safety of your crop in mind as well. I do know some folks that are using things like this when I saw home plate there, around your structures, around your high tunnel perimeters, around the edges of the barn, or along your driveways and things like that. I think there are some uses for them there for sure, and keeping like perimeters and things at bay. Let's talk about vinegar. Um, This is agricultural, high concentration vinegar, 10 to 30%. I've seen the one I've used in the past has been like 20% vinegar. Um, it is considered a pesticide. It is going to burn. It is not your typical kitchen vinegar, but it's a much softer way to kind of fight back some of these weeds that we're trying to deal with. But check with your certifier. That's a good piece of advice, I would say, for any chemical, any inputs. If you are certified organic, or if you're moving towards certification, always verifying that the product you're using is approved for organics, using the omri.org, or the Organic Material Review Institute, to see what the listing is, whether it is approved, restricted, or prohibited. And then if you're certified, still running it by your certifier, asking them in writing, send an email that you have this issue and you're looking at using this product, and get verbal, written is best approval to do that. And then, yeah, wear PPE. PPE could be a lot of things. Read the label to understand. It might be long pants, gloves, and a long sleeve shirt. It might be a respirator, so you need to really know what you're working with, because burns to the skin, severe eye injury, blindness, all of these things would be bad when we are just trying to stop some weeds from growing on our farms. So, corn gluten, do you know anything about this, Sarah? This,
Yeah, so I don't know. It's out there in the world. There's been some recommendations. There's a lot of talk, I think, especially with like home gardeners, about the use of corn gluten meal as a pre-emergent herbicide option. Um, it's often sold like for a more natural like weed control and turf grass. It works by inhibiting germination. And so there's kind of mixed research on the efficacy of corn gluten meal, whether or not it's actually useful for agricultural systems. Important to note that it is also a type of slow release fertilizer. It has the 9% nitrogen content, right? And so, if the weeds do survive, then you're feeding them as well. It will
it's
inhibit
an option.
germination
Yeah.
of your direct seeded crops too. So it's not recommended, like, if you are going to try using this, like, only use it in areas where you're going to be transplanting, because that pre-emergent germination inhibition applies not just to the weed seeds, but to any crop seeds that might be planted. And then the application rates are pretty high for effect, like what we've seen for recommendations for effective control. I'll drop some research in the chat. about corn gluten meal. There's some different products on the market. And I guess I would just say, like, the companies that are selling these different chemicals like to tout how well they work and their benefits, but I would encourage folks to actually like look for some efficacy data or research on the products that's available. So I've tried to provide some links here and we'll send them in a follow-up email. But and then also maybe try them out yourself before investing heavily in them as a management strategy. And Russell, I think it's just one season. It's not a long-term pre-emergent because it'll break down over time. So, but for example, that, 30 pounds, I looked up how much that costs. These days, it's $95 for 30 pounds of that product. And it's, eighth of an acre that it's going to cover. So,
Yeah.
and these organic chemicals kind of across the board are relatively expensive. So, as Joe said, you really need to think about, like, are they going to be helpful? Is there a certain situation where, like, maybe you've had a really wet spring and so you haven't been able to get in with your cultivation equipment to manage weeds? Like, maybe you could utilize some organic chemistry to burn down weeds. I've also seen some material out there about farmers like using the organic chemicals to burn down a crop to make harvest easier. So, like, spraying it on potatoes to burn the plants down before harvest, to reduce that, like, plant material that you have to deal with. But yeah, that's what I know about corn gluten meal. So
Cool. Cool.
yeah.
So there's stuff out there. There's stuff out there to check. That's interesting. Um, so some next steps, trying to identify your weeds year round. We've talked about making a map for identifying weed hotspots on your farm, looking at the resources you already have, what tools you have access to resources, to kind of create like what strategies fit your system. Um, and we're going to try to wrap all this up into kind of developing that integrated weed management plan at our last session in 2 weeks. We hope you all will join us um, back for that. And then, um, oh, sorry. Yes. So we're going to talk more about evaluation and monitoring. We've kind of walked through the identification step. We talked a lot about prevention and cultural controls. This week we hit the biological, mechanical, and organic. And so in that last session, we're going to kind of try to create a more, holistic framework across your farm and how you think about weeds and plan to control them, evaluate whether or not those things are working. So we're going to put that kind of all together and we'll be back here in 2 weeks to do this again. Looking forward to it. Sarah, is there anything we need to mention before we say bye?
I don't think so. Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Hope you
everybody.
join us for the next session. And yeah, we'll send a follow-up email with the resources and a copy of the presentation. So thanks, Joe. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you guys. Yeah, thanks everybody.